recording because it's not instantly posted. So, all right. So today we have our last class to summarize all that we've learned, right? And then on Wednesday, we'll go over the final exam, and we'll talk about anything that we need to go over in regards to special wording and what would be the expectations of the exam, right? And then on Monday, I just want to let you know, while we're scheduled for class and while I said we're not going to have class, I will be in the classroom. So if anybody wants to bring a draft or anything that you've been working on related to the exam or to the research essay, come in, I can review it, I can give you some thoughts or editings or tell you great job and don't worry about any further, okay? So I'll be here on Monday, that's the 10th. If you remember, all of your assignments are due on the 12th, okay? So that's that kind of last minute push and any assistance that you might need, okay? So, can't see you over. All right, there you go. Okay, so just a reminder as to where we're headed and what we're up to, all right? Now, if you look at your Moodle site for your class, I've posted the assignment for the research essay, right? If you turn it in later than the 12th because you have an issue or a problem, send me an email, let me know to expect it, okay? And it'll just be marked as late if it comes in like that under the system, right? Okay, so, all right. Let's go on talking about a summary, basically about what we've been learning, okay? So, came into class talking about what is anthropology, right? We took a look at how we define culture, right? System of ideas, right? Knowledge, values, beliefs, plans, learned in society, guiding behavior, varying by environment. Now we've got a complete understanding as to the details of all this, right? Okay. Going further, we talked about the different fields. We've been specializing in cultural anthropology with a bit of an emphasis on environmental, right? Although we've talked at length about cognitive anthropology, cognitive mapping even, right? If you remember that. And a bit about ecological anthropology, a little bit about ethnographies as well, right? We also talked a fair amount about culture clash, especially in relation to whaling, right? We talked about the case of the macaw and their whaling of the gray whale. Said that there was a huge culture clash between this indigenous group, right, and animal rights activists and whatnot, okay? So that was an interesting case for us to examine. And again, also taking a later look at the umialit, right, with the bowhead whale, all right? So make sure that we can distinguish between the gray whale with the macaw, yeah, and the umialit whaling of the bowhead, okay? All right. From there, we went on to talk about ethnocentrism and our concern about the way we've been interpreting cultures, right? We'll go on into week 2 next, right, where we talked about the theory, but just getting into things, we said, you know, ethnocentrism is what we think of as racism. We say that this is something that we don't want to embody. It's a form of judging other cultures through our own, right? And ways we got around some of the problems of ethnocentrism was listening to Franz Boas and his ideas about getting into the field. Get into the field, stay there a long time, right? And try and see if you can take a culturally relative approach, right? Understand that history and place is transforming the way different cultures evolve in any given environment, right? Okay. And then we talked about human rights. And interestingly enough, the last class we talked about how we've got this confusion with cultural relativism and human rights. Remember that? Right here, week 1, we kind of threw it in there just to get you ready for it, okay? And we talked more specifically about intellectual property rights, or IPRs. But in this sense, we were starting to get into the discussion about human rights, right? Okay. Now, what are intellectual property rights? Do you guys remember that? Talking about things like quinine, right? Do you remember quinine? Quinine's what the indigenous people in South America call the holy bark tree, right? They say something that they discovered was this tree and its ability to ward off things like malaria, right? And the discovery was shared. And now, as you well know, we have malaria pills, we have tonic water, which incorporates quinine for travelers if you want to just drink tonic water, right? Multi-million-dollar kind of an industry, and yet the people that discovered it didn't get any benefits from it. Very little recognition. You can go to Wikipedia and find out how it was discovered. Yay, right? Not even advertising that this was an indigenous find. Maybe that's just because at that time we had over 90% of all our medicines coming from places like this, right? So talked about intellectual property rights in regards to human rights, okay? And the need to really protect the cultures that are making these discoveries, keeping this knowledge, protecting this knowledge. Do you remember maybe 2 weeks ago we said that there's a Brazilian indigenous group that just came out with a 500-page encyclopedia on medicinal plants and uses and things like that? This is exactly what we're talking about. I'm so glad that they published it, right? Because you would think that, I hope, that the structure is there for payment to them, right? Okay. So that was week 1, right? And of course, for extra credit, we got into the Nasarema. You remember what that was about? Why did we read that? Those of you that read it, right? This was an extra credit. Why did we read that? Do you remember what was funny about that reading? Yeah? It was American backwards, right? It almost took a while to get that, though, didn't it? Like you got part of the way through and reading about these strange people that had these strange practices. They stick, brushes in their teeth to take care of their mouth and, whatnot. But the way it was written, it was really odd, right? So this is our introduction into looking at ourselves as if we were odd, right? Or from an outsider's perspective, perhaps, right? Kind of an attempt for that. Okay. All right. Then we got into theory. All right. Beginning with evolution, we talked a little bit of archaeology, although, again, reminder, I'm not that kind of an expert. Spoke more about the Pleistocene overkill, right? Now, what was that? What was the Pleistocene overkill? Don't look up there. Talk to me. Right? What was it about? What do we say? What happened during the Pleistocene? Yes? Overhunt, right? Overhunted all the megafauna, right? All the large animals, right? So we get this hypothesis that the new people on the land here in Turtle Island or this hemisphere, whatever you want to call it, right? First thing that we did was shoot ourselves in the foot. We overhunted to the point where we caused mass extinctions, right? And again, this is just a theory. This is just a hypothesis. Maybe there's a different kind of explanation, but so far this is what we think. Environmentalists, this is one of our biggest statements here. Perfect example of when given the chance, humans will shoot themselves in the foot or hunt the last animal, fish the last fish, right? Put the last cattle on the field that we can that will cause the field to become destroyed, right? By overgrazing, whatever have you, okay? So we talked about the Pleistocene overkill, briefly mentioned the tragedy of the commons. Do you remember this discussion? Tragedy of the commons. I'm just going to write his name up here. The theorist, Garrett Hardin. He was the one that talked about the overgrazing, remember, in England of the common lands, right? Okay, and our natural propensity toward being selfish, right? Wow, we even went into selfishness, but we'll get there just a moment, okay? All right. We talked about methods of cultural change, spoke more of cultural change in the last couple of weeks, so we'll get to that a little bit further. Globalization, briefly mentioned it, but then we got into early evolutionism. Remember that, right? Edward Taylor, if you're going just strictly by the text reading, Edward Taylor was written about, but secondarily, and more importantly, was our review of Lewis Henry Morgan. You remember that? Okay, Ancient Society was the book reading, right? I think it was 1778. And we have this, well, maybe my dates are off. Maybe it's 1870. Well, I'll have to relook that one up. Okay, and we get this structure of society, right? Lewis Henry Morgan says, there's evolution in culture, evolution in society. We can't deny that. And he says, here's a structure to explain that, right? And it was a long time back. And this was the kind of structure that a lot of those travelers going around the world, meeting other people from the first contact, had this kind of a perspective in mind. Remember the Calvinists that we read about with the Hawaii case of contact? This was the perspective that was in mind at contact. I think it's really important that we know that. Yeah? Okay. So we have savagery, this idea that we're at an infant stage in society, right? And we're not all that advanced, right? And then from there, we maybe advance into a stage that has been labeled by Lewis Henry Morgan as barbarianism, right? Wow, these terms are just really amazing, right? When you think about it. Barbarianism. And then lastly, our last stage of evolution, right, was civilized, right? We saw that he placed Native Hawaiians in this strange place of upper savagery because they had not invented what? Pottery. Good job. And why? Let's ask why. Why did they not invent pottery? No need, right? No need. Okay, we had coconuts, we had gourds, we had all kinds of other things that were sufficing for that kind of a thing, right? And although we have them placed in this stage of savagery, really a lot of their advancements as a culture and as a people is so far advanced, right? Okay. So we call this structure racist, obviously, but this was important for us to understand the beginnings of evolutionism and where we came into contact with other cultures, right? And where we started in terms of assessing other cultures. Okay. I'm going to skip Engels and matrilineal and Marxism and continue on here. Let's see. Let's get into sociobiology, right? So we had this other aspect in theory talking about sociobiology from the perspective of altruism. And we said, is there such a thing as altruism? Now we have some sociobiologists today saying, no. There is no such thing as altruism. What did we say it was? What did we say it was? Why is it that people are acting selflessly? In this perspective, right? Again, this is just a theory, not my theory specifically, maybe not yours either. But the idea was, do you remember? Because by acting in that way, we become perhaps more desirable to others, more liked by others. There's something in it for us as acting in goodwill, right? This was the idea that there is no such thing as altruism, right? Okay. So that was an important piece to take a look at. And as it relates to environmentalism, we could kind of carry this out into environmentalism as well, right? And say, by example, really hard for us not to be selfish because this is our innate nature. So when given the chance, that's what we're going to do because we're selfish, right? Hence the concern of environmentalists, right? Okay, we also talk about the feminist perspectives and the problems that we as anthropologists have in being able to interact with women, right? Feels really, really weird to tell you this and to talk about it, right? Even today, when we talked about it then and again today, it seems weird for me as a female to stand up here in front of you and to say it's difficult for us, even as female anthropologists, to talk to women, right? A large majority of the Mayagna women that I worked with did not speak Spanish. They did not speak English. And the only way I was able to talk with them was through a translator, oftentimes, 99% of the time, male, right? More and more, there are female leaders that are coming up and we can rely on them. But in the vast majority, we have this problem of getting a voice that we can't hear, right? We can't even get that female to female scientist to, right, person in the culture group. Can you shut that door, please? Right? In that regard, we have to somehow figure out a way to get that voice, and it's darn near impossible. So we have this interesting piece by Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak?, talking about women as an alternative group. Yeah, we're one of the largest minorities, maybe right next to indigenous people. And worldwide, we don't have a voice very much. Okay. Talked about interpretive anthropology, said, maybe it's possible that we could say all of anthropology is just an interpretation. Taking it further into postmodernism, remember we said that under postmodernism, we would even call anthropology just a reflection of anthropology and not a reflection of another culture, right? Because we've had to learn anthropology under this system, this Marxist liberal system, or whatever have you, depending upon whatever kind of university you attend, right? Yeah. Okay, so it's possible that anthropology, as we have up here, is just another tool used by dominant powers to control others, right? Certainly we've heard this comment out there. And the concept of hegemony when we have domination that we don't even realize that we're having, right? Does the rest of the world take a look at anthropology and realize how Western it is? What kinds of perspectives we promote more than others? Maybe not, right? The postmodernists would say, we got to look at this. We got to check it out, right? And again, that reminder for the native anthropologists, the anthropologists writing about their own culture. Remember the friend that we had that came up from the Mayagna culture and went to the museum at Bishop Museum in Oahu. We saw that fork on display representing Fiji, right? Fork used to eat people. And he said, I don't think the Fijians really were the ones that chose to put that there, right? So we've got a problem with who's representing cultures, who's writing about cultures, and who's even building the assessment as to how to do it, okay, in regards to postmodernism. So we got to be careful with what we're up to, especially applied work, remember? All right, okay. Now, so going from there to methods, ethics, and application, we reviewed a couple of cases that were pretty unbelievable. One being the case of Naui, the Evi case, or the case of the bones, Evi meaning bones, right, in Kauai, North Shore Kauai, where we had a developer build a house right on top of indigenous bones, right, Native American grave sites. 33 different family groupings of burials, right? Pretty amazing that we can still, up to this day, as archaeologists, maybe even get paid off to make some kind of a decision that might affect people in a very negative way. Okay. All right. Also talked about ethics in relation to interviewing people underage and with difficult topics, right? And then also talked about Napoleon Chagnon and his work in Venezuela with the Yanomamo, right? Where he was describing them as brutish, ape-like, aggressive demonstrators of the fighting nature of what it meant to be human, right? Ultimately kicked out of the country for what he wrote about. Okay, so we looked at other anthropologists' work around the world in areas that were kind of questionable. Then we talked about ethics, right? Said, for us, we have this list. We have this list of the top 11 ethical issues, right? Informed consent. Got to make sure we inform people what we're up to. Voluntary participation, right? Privacy, confidentiality. Got to remember that there are consequences when people participate with us, right? Even posting a photograph on Facebook can tip off a whole nother group into targeting people, especially when you're working in things like land rights. Just think about it, right? Land is just huge, right? People fight tooth and nail to the death for land, okay? Talked about cultural and gender sensitivity, protecting vulnerable populations, and payment of informants that we're working with, right? How do we honor the other when we're asking a lot of them? Advocacy, honesty of results, right? Okay, and then spoke a little bit about anthropologists being involved in the military, right? What did we say about anthropologists in the military? What was our concern primarily with that? Yeah.
They had to follow the rules of whoever's in charge.
Right, their boss. They got to follow their boss's rules, whoever's in charge, maybe the U.S. government, maybe some other military government. And what does that mean that they don't follow? Confidentiality is our biggest issue, right? Right. Okay, and protecting vulnerable populations is probably another part. Okay. All right. Talked about Kennewick Man. Do you remember Kennewick Man and the development of NAGPRA? What is NAGPRA? Do you remember the acronym? What is NAGPRA? Native American, got that. Keep going. Graves, right? Repatriation, which means reburial, right? And Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Okay? And Kennewick Man was that individual that was around 9,100 years old, right? Found in Kennewick, Washington. Taken in by the University of Washington, our university, right? Stored currently in Burke Museum. Went to court over it. We claimed that it didn't look like one of the indigenous groups that was claiming it, the Umatilla. Second. Ultimately, the judge said, want to do anything to the body, you got to ask the culture group. Yay, right? They have dominion and authoritative law. Very good. Got the case of the Kumeyaay here in Southern California that's very, very similar, right? Then we went into talking about scientific method, okay? Operational definitions being one of the big issues of the day, right? I don't know if you remember, but when we've been looking at news and taking a look at current events and things like that, we're always asking, well, gosh, I wonder how they measure that. I wonder how they measure that. This is that example of we need to figure out how we're measuring things, right? Okay. Let's see what else we touched on that was liability, validity, assessment. We talked also about how a large number of today's scientific studies, you can even see it, I think maybe a month ago, they even published another statement about it, that a large majority of today's studies are not being retested. This is science, right? Where we retest the same methods, try and get the same results. So this is something that we're failing at now in your current experience of science, something to be really aware of, right? All right, let's go on from there. From there, we got into ecological anthropology, right? Talked about the IPCC. What is the IPCC? Do you remember? Intergovernmental panel for what? The answer's up there. Everybody look up there. Kidding. Climate change, right? It's either up there or it's down there, right? Okay. Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. We looked at the Cancun agreements. Do you know we're presently going into another meeting? Do you know that? We're in the middle of going into another meeting right now. How many people knew that? Our world is going into another one of these meetings currently. So we're in the middle of these kinds of discussions right now. We read about the UN Red. Do we remember UN Red? United Nations Reduction of Environmental Devastation and Deforestation, right? Don't forget that some of those kinds of projects, indigenous people are calling that those projects are causing hunger, right? How's that the case? Do you remember? We talked about this. How is it that environmentalist climate change projects are causing hunger for indigenous people on their lands? Do you remember? What do we decide at these meetings? How much more to eat up of the environment? What do we decide at these meetings? No, we don't, right? What do we decide at these meetings? How to constrain ourselves, right? Conservation, it's about conservation. So when we're thinking about areas of biodiversity hotspots, this is where the indigenous people are primarily located, right? Don't forget that, right? We saw that Venn diagram. This is the same at the end of this lecture. We got that Venn diagram from Katie Moran's reading that said, hey, when you look at all the biodiversity hotspots around the world, overlap the indigenous international population, you'll see that they correlate. Meaning the indigenous people are on the front lines of those biodiversity hotspots. And because of that, and because of our concern for the environment, we're making decisions that are affecting those people on the front lines, right? Like, don't cut down that many trees, or don't hunt the Baird's tapir, even though we might have a disagreement as to the numbers in Nicaragua, right? Scientists said, oh, there aren't even any Baird's tapir or any golden eagles in the middle of Nicaragua. Nuh-uh, we have a bunch of them, which goes to say that science didn't know, right? And now we've got more regulations on those things that science didn't really know, okay? And it's affecting people's lives and food intake even, right? Okay, so that was the UN Red. There's the Tragedy of the Commons. You see that link there? Tragedy of the Commons with Garrett Hardin from 1968. So something to take a look at if you don't really remember that. We went over Malthus's essay on population from 1798, right? And his concern that we were going to overshoot our resource base with our population, right? So then we began looking at other modes of cultural adaptation and things that people are using to protect lands, right? Took a look at Gilbert's reading, okay? And protecting indigenous cultures who are protecting land, okay? As a way to do both. Here was our first look at the UN DRIP, right? From 2007. And our first discussion of ILO Convention 169. Now, if you remember, the UN DRIP has a lot of specific things about rights of indigenous people. They also talk about what indigenous people are. ILO has something that people call a definition, but not really is a definition of indigenous people. It just says this agreement applies to these kinds of people. But it's a more open definition of who it applies to than the UN DRIP, okay? They say tribal peoples, which might mean just clan groups, not necessarily indigenous with historical timeframes, okay? But saying some very important things for people about land. Governments shall respect the special importance for cultures and spiritual values of people concerned of their relationship with the lands or territories, or both, as applicable, which they occupy or otherwise use, and in particular, the collective aspects of the relationship. So we've got our introduction into the UN DRIP and the ILO, and then we took our midterm. All right, this is our kind of review of the whole entire class. It's one of my favorite classes to do this, right? It's kind of incorporate everything at once. So from there, just to remind you, our final is not accumulative. So now starts kind of where we would start our final, right? Okay. All right. From there, we started talking about environmental anthropology, not ecological. Remember, ecological is more taking a look at the person inside the ecosystem. Environmentalism or environmental anthropology is more about management. How do we manage the land? How do we defend the land? How do we think about the land? What do we know of the land, right? And this is where we had the reading of Katie Moran, and we also talked about language, right? Here's where we had a really interesting connection of a bunch of concepts all together. We said, you know what? Language is really important. We said language will be different in different cultures. So every single language that we have is important because it represents what people think about their world. Land, species, worldview, everything, right? So language is critical. We also said that through language is where we protect our knowledge, like the environmental knowledge, knowledge of species, knowledge of the ecosystem, management, etc., right? And we said that when we cut ourselves off from the land, physical removal, displacement, whatever you want to call it, right? Removal, that oftentimes affects our knowledge of the land, our language, and even our ability to maintain our language and the special knowledge that it's connected to, right? Because we no longer are grounded in that environment. Now, if you remember, Jared Diamond was the one that taught us that. Do you remember what he said? One fish. He worked with a group, the Foray in Papua New Guinea. One fish they knew of. The heck is up with that, right? I mean, I would expect every single person on this world would know more than one fish. Wouldn't you? But they only knew one fish. What else did they not know of, which was surprising? Do you remember? Yeah? Stars, right? Didn't know about the stars. I thought every indigenous group knew about the stars. This one doesn't. Why not? Rainforest, right? Okay, so because we didn't see it, because we didn't interact with it regularly, if we're not studying it in textbooks, what we get from the land is only what our environment brings us, right? And if that means we don't see the stars, obviously we won't have knowledge of the stars. So here's where we say knowledge is utilitarian. Use it or lose it. You will maintain it if you're using it, right? This is where we say if we're removed from the lands and we're not using the knowledge anymore, that knowledge is disappearing, right? Weren't you into fishing or hunting or something like that? Right. Okay, when was the last time you went?
Last season.
Last season. Okay, so still using it, right? You could tell us something about the populations of what was it?
I mean, we
Hunt everything. Great. How are the hunting populations doing?
pretty well. Like quail is low right now.
Quail is low.
We had a lot of dove.
Lot of dove.
And a lot of deer.
Lot of deer. Why is quail low?
I don't remember. There's some reason.
We'll have to look into that. But you know, right? Here's somebody that takes advantage of the environment regularly, and he knows about the environment. Stop the hunting, and he's not going to know, right? Makes sense. Okay. All right. So we talked a lot about knowledge and environmental management. Looked at the caribou management by the Cree, right, which was pretty interesting, and the fact that they have a lot of knowledge to share with science about the health of the animal, their distribution, right, fattiness by just hunting, right? You can tell this as well. Okay, all right. And Katie Moran talking about the need to support indigenous people. All right, so that's where we came with environmental anthropology, and then we went on to talk about food. Oh my gosh, food, right? Genetic engineering. Some of those things that are pretty interesting. Oh my gosh, what happened about genetic engineering in the last week? Do you know? Monsanto got sued, probably. Monsanto's, but like in a significant way? Okay, in Europe, is that what it was? Yeah, because they've been like moving their base so they can avoid that. Okay, so that's something that's huge. I've been watching a little bit about that. Glad to know. I wasn't up on that. Thank you. Anything else about genetic engineering? Not food related. Medically related. Let's see if we can pull it up. Happened in China. That help anybody? China opened a Pandora's box of human genetic engineering. Did you know about this? They genetically engineered twins using the CRISPR. Remember, we talked about the CRISPR, right? This new thing that just cuts DNA, and you can go in and edit the DNA. They did. They edited these babies to be resistant to the AIDS virus. Oh my gosh, right? And we're thinking that like this is going to change all of their descendants too. All of their descendants are going to be edited so that they're resistant as a human species to the AIDS virus. This just blows your mind, right? Anybody ever heard about this yet? No. Okay, it's just this last week that came out and people are freaking out about it because it means we can do anything, right? I mean, like say goodbye to disease kind of thing. But then, boy, Malthus is really going to have another discussion about things, right? From the grave, maybe, but, right? Population out of control if we just make it so we don't have diseases. But this is fascinating. Something to think about. Okay, so talked about food and genetic engineering on both sides. Then we went into rituals, ceremonies, spoke more about cannibalism right around Halloween, right? That was kind of a fun one. Did you guys like that? Do you like talking about cannibalism around Halloween? Scary stuff, right? Mostly what we found was a lot of the discussions about cannibalism were embellished, right? For what purposes? Colonization, basically, but we can take it in the name of anything from religion to whatever have you, right? But in this area, it was most specifically, we called this population, the new population we encountered, savage, obviously. We call them savages right from the start, right? Called them cannibals and said that their behavior was incredibly unchristian, right? And they needed to be saved. So that was part and parcel for justifying colonization, okay? Medical anthropology took a look at diseases from different cultural perspectives, right? We looked at greasy sickness, possibly happening through trauma. Remember that? Where we had a series of 10 years dealing with battling tribal groups that were our sister tribal groups, right? Maybe developing some sense of trauma, or in terms of the local culture, what do they call it? Possession, spiritual possession. So we had this argument as to, well, what is it really? Is it trauma or is it spiritual possession? And they gave kind of an interesting amount of evidence to suggest that it was spiritual possession. So that was kind of an interesting thing to look at. Then went on to Jared Diamond's next piece, right? We looked at the foray. This is his next piece looking at disease. What was the theory that he used? Remember, we just talked about it. Something happened during the Pleistocene era, right? The Pleistocene overkill theory, we think, causing a lack of large mammals. Yeah, we still had some, right? But not that many. Then when we bring in a lot of those animals from Europe at contact, then we don't have the immunities developed and we see what we saw in Hawaii, 98% population loss due to disease and death and things like that. 98. 90 to 98 is your general statistics with contact and loss of population. This is why we're so concerned about the uncontacted tribes still, right, in South America. How many people took a look at the uncontacted tribes? Oh, keep checking it out, okay, because they're still there. All right, went on to talk about the UN DRIP. Said 4 countries said no way in the very beginning. You remember what they were? Which ones were they? Just remember. Yep. US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Still not have signed, only endorsing certain articles, right? And we think that this is the case because of why? Why are we not signing the UN DRIP and are only endorsing certain articles? Got different reasons in different countries. What about our reason? You have to give all the land back, right? Canada has huge cases of missing women. You know about this, right? We've talked about this still to this day, right? I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the last 2 weeks, we had a class action suit that just was started because a well-known news case came into public light, and that was that a couple that had given birth, female indigenous, had to sign a mandatory sterilization piece, sterilizing her so that she wouldn't have further children. And this came into the news, and we found out about it. It was disgusting, right? We heard about this, and now it's become a class action suit, meaning there's 90 other women that have already joined in 1 week. 90 other indigenous women are demonstrating that Canada has some policies whereby they're sterilizing indigenous women so they can't have more kids. I mean, it's like jaw-dropping, right? So that's more with Canada. Australia, we've got a lot of children that were removed from their families. Same thing with New Zealand. Okay, putting them into foster care where they actually ended up becoming slaves as children. So then we looked at the UN DRIP and how we might be able to adjudicate some kind of a thing like that, right? Do you remember how we adjudicated land rights with the Mayagna in Nicaragua? What did we do? I mean, we have the right under here, so what did we do? How did we pressure Nicaragua? Took them to court outside of their country, right? Under the OAS and the UN system, and we got the award, right? We won the case, and then Nicaragua said, right? What'd we do? Because we found something that worked. What'd we do? World Bank committed to pull all their funding, right? That was somewhere between 60 and 70% of all Nicaragua's annual spending, right? So that was one of the ways that we manipulated and coerced the nation state into titling lands to the people, right? Okay. Talked about gut blood. Talked about some surprising issues where under our laws in the US, Native Americans have to qualify by blood quantum. What does that mean for them in the future? Pardon? Going to dwindle their populations, right? Meaning over time we expect there to be no indigenous populations in the United States. Yeah? Maybe a question of how many generations are left, right? We talk about San Manuel up here with only 100 members. We talk about the Morongo Band of Mission Indians just down the street, down the 10 here. They only have 800 tribal members. Again, how many generations are left? So this is an issue that could be brought against the United States under the UN DRIP. But again, the question of how do we coerce them to focus on redesigning the laws so that we maintain our native population as opposed to annihilate them? Big question, right? Okay. Going further, we went into political anthropology, colonialism, and imperialism. Do you remember the definition difference between colonialism and imperialism? What's the difference? They're both establishing a colony, but one has what? Force, right? Force. So, yeah, they colonized Hawaii, but when they brought the battleship into Pearl Lagoon, and then when they put a bayonet against the head of the queen to sign the bayonet constitution, that's like force, right? That's force. That's imperialism. Okay. Let's see. There might be something more that we might want to talk about in this lecture. Let's take a look here. Yeah, that's what I thought. So then we went further into talking about world systems and colonialism, talking about the development of the first, second, and third worlds, right? As having happened because of colonialism, right? Having happened because of this age of exploration that we had. And how it developed this kind of economy of core, semi-periphery, periphery. What's the G8? Or what's the G20? The G somethings. What am I talking about? Do you know what I'm talking about? G8, G20. They're not pets, right? This is in relation to international relations, right? Have you ever heard of these things before? G8? I bet you have, right? You've heard of the G20, right? Never, not even, no, this is as foreign as if they were something else. Okay, so the G20 is a list of 20 countries, okay? The G8 is a list of 8 countries. Why don't we take a look? Who are the G8? G8, let's look it up. Group of 8. Well, let's go to Wikipedia, even though we don't really like doing that, okay? Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's curious. Okay, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, United Kingdom, US, European Union. I'm surprised that China is not in there, and I'm wondering if they're right with that. Okay. What do you notice about those countries? Anything? Think money. What do you notice about them? Any third world countries in there? No. Okay, what does this suggest? These countries are primarily economically prosperous. We can also say powerful as well, okay? Why do you think we have a group that meets these 8, some of the most prosperous, powerful countries in the world? What do you think we do when we come together? Big stuff. Think about it, okay? Let's take a look at the G20. Okay. Let's see if we can get a list of the G20. Oh, there we go. Okay. Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, European Union, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, and UK, and the US. Spain is a permanent guest invitee. I don't know why, right? What are they up to? Do you notice anything about those numbers? There's your map. They just met. They just met just this last week. The G20 met in Argentina, and out of this meeting, both China and the United States agreed to take our trade wars down a little bit. So what kinds of things are happening at these meetings? Trade negotiations, business negotiations, things that are affecting the world in a very globalized way, right? Can you see that? Think about the G20. And now the G8. Boy, this is a really big, powerful group of countries, okay? We need to start thinking in terms of global governance and what is really happening here, okay? This is outside of the UN, outside of the International Criminal Court, outside of all of those kinds of structures. This is an independent structure, right? Okay, and based in economics. So when we're talking about the core economies, remember we talked about the periphery economies and how we have the third world still today in those periphery economies. Well, we still have the core economies coming together to this very day and deciding as to the future of our global economy. Don't forget that, right? All right, so that's something really important for us to remember and to take a look at, okay? All right, let's see. I think then we took a look at global approaches toward indigenous people under this lecture. I want to remind you, everybody here, and not everybody's here, so I'm depressed, okay? That means some people are going to get it wrong if they're not listening or if they weren't told. Remember, we're not using Google, right? You Google protectionism, you Google integrationism, and you're going to come out with some economic principle, okay? This is specifically in relation to what we talk about with indigenous people. So we said our first kind of agreed upon global approach toward indigenous people was protectionism, that they somehow don't have the ability to protect themselves. So we need to develop a structure to protect them, right? And we have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, our big fraudulent agency of the US government, right? Among other kinds of international groups, agencies, and institutions. Integrationism then said, again, specifically with indigenous people, we got to integrate them, assimilate them, almost as if it's in their human right to deserve the same kinds of opportunities as non-indigenous, so we'll justify that and assimilate them. Round the backside, we were also taking a lot of their lands, right, for resolving population problems, okay? Preservationism, got to preserve them. Kind of turned a bit, right? All of a sudden we go from, we got to assimilate them, make them like everybody else, to, oh no, they're special. There's something that we need to take care of them about, right? Only, again, this similar problem of we got to preserve it just the way it is, right? As if they're living museums without the right to evolve, right? Remember our discussions about technology. Oh, they can't use technology if they're going to assert indigenous traditional rights, yeah? No harpoon gun. No snowmobiles for the Salma, right? And then we went further to a new indigenous territory model where we're becoming proponents of arguing for the full outright land ownership of the indigenous people of their own ancestral lands, right? One caveat though, internationally, we're not ready to allow it to happen completely, right? Because of this, you now see us mandating that they demonstrate maps of land use before they receive rights. If it doesn't look good, they don't get the right. We talked about that, didn't we? Yeah? So now every indigenous group that wants internationally recognized rights to land, they have to prove how they're going to use it. Here's our stand of old growth rainforest, by example. Okay? All right. Had three terms that were important. One was self-determination, right? The ability to determine for oneself, one's future, especially as a culture group, right? Therefore, when we pressure cultures from the outside, we're not really asserting that right. Development on their own terms. Or you remember the term development from the inside, right? Where outsiders only act as facilitators, helping that create a process from the base or grassroots, whatever have you. Okay? Autonomy, self-law, the right to rule yourself under self-law, right? And sovereignty, royal power and authority, and that's more in relation to groups and governments being able to assert, hey, get the heck out, right? We've basically talked a little bit about Israel. We've talked about them being sovereign. Some consider them one of the very first sovereign indigenous nations in the world. To that regard, if that's what they have, and if that's who they have that ability of sovereignty and self-determination by saying, you know what, UN, you want to come into our country? No, can't. Won't let them come in, right? That's sovereignty. That would be the same as our US country saying, we're a sovereign country, we're going to let some in, we're not going to let others in, right? So that sovereignty is that ability of royal power and authority to decide in the face of whatever have you, be it manipulation through grants, the UN, or other kinds of structures, right? All right. So let's see. Last section here, we went into human rights, right? Talked about Paulo Freire, you remember him? Talking about a different kind of education, right? Consciousness raising, not about telling others what to do. Talked about that being an important thing in this world that we call development, right? Where cultural change is really happening all around the world. We all say that we have rights to cultural change, right? And yet, a lot of that cultural change for indigenous people and poor communities are coming from the outside in, right? Where they're being told what to do, including all of our funding that stipulates, well, they have to do it like this in order for them to get funding. And any group that's proposing something else isn't going to get the grant because it's supposed to look like this, right? So that's how we've tended to do our interaction with others under the guise of what we call sustainable development, right? Some, just to remind you, have talked about the UN DRIP being able to be whittled down to just that free, prior, informed consent. Did we talk about this, right? Okay. And I want to remind you about that this kind of gives us an indication about how far we've come with the UN DRIP, right? Because it's still telling us that they are going to have to focus the majority of their human rights on how they react to others, right? We talked about the signature of a consent and that it's something brought from others, okay? So while we've put together a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it's primarily oriented on how to defend themselves against others. It's really surprising when you look at it, right? Okay, but maybe common to other kinds of declarations like the Declaration on the Rights of Child. Okay. All right. Development from the outside, development from within, we distinguish those. Said one is more as a facilitator, the other one is more directive of the process, right? And then we took a look at the Awastingi case. All right, so that's kind of a review of the semester. What I'd like to ask now is, are there any questions about anything that we've talked about through the whole semester? Any concepts, any things that you're questioning or confused or interested in? Zero. Are you surprised that you didn't know what the G8 and the G20 are? Yeah, you're surprised. Okay, so nobody got it in high school. You didn't talk about that in high school? No. And how many people are freshmen here? Raise your hands. So maybe a fourth, right? How many people are sophomores? Ooh, vast majority. Okay, how many juniors? Do we have any? One. Seniors? Two. Okay, so that we've got kind of sophomore. Okay, so those of you that are sophomores, are you surprised you didn't hear about it last year? Did any of you take political science last year? You did, and you didn't talk about the G20. Okay, well, I guess this maybe tells us all that we need to keep up our own research. So when you see news, check out the news all the time, right? And when you see the news and you see something that's weird and says, well, what the heck is a G20, right? Look it up, right? Because you might be surprised by what you find, right? Did some similar work on the structure of the UN over the summer, and it blew my mind, right? One could spend 10 years just trying to figure out the structure of the UN and why some countries vote one way over another. Okay, so again, there are things out there that you might not learn about, but you might see as like, wow, what's that? Take a look it up, check it out, right? And ask others if you're confused about it. Okay. All right. Any other questions? No? Okay. When we come back, yes.
Have you graded all the outlines?
I'm in the middle of finishing that up. When we come back,